The US national debt is often discussed with an air of urgency and alarm, as if it were an inevitable disaster waiting to unfold. The figure currently sitting at around $36 trillion, which by the way could be a lot more by the time you watch this video, seems overwhelming, especially when you have to consider that it equates to over $106,000 of debt for every man, woman, and child in the country. However, what if I told you that the US will never likely pay off this debt, and more importantly, it doesn't have to. The US government, whether by design or necessity, is inflating away the debt over time, making it less burdensome year by year. This isn't a flaw in the system. It is how the system is designed to work. And they figured this out a very long time ago. When we think about debt, we usually frame it in personal terms. If you or I take out a loan, there's that expectation that we will eventually repay the loan. And the longer it takes for us to repay that loan, the more interest we pay. And if we default, the consequences are severe: damaged credit score, repossession, or even bankruptcy. But the government debt operates completely differently. The US, as the world's largest economy, has unique tools at its disposal. Chief among these tools is inflation. Inflation, far from being a mere side effect of economic policy, plays a critical part in reducing the real burden of US debt over time. While the nominal figure of debt continues to grow rapidly, the true weight of this debt, its real value in today's dollars, decreases thanks to inflation. Let's break this down. Inflation, at its core, is a process by which the purchasing power of money decreases. With inflation, the value of each dollar shrinks, meaning it takes more dollars to buy the same goods and services. While this can be frustrating for the consumer who sees price rises for everyday items, it's actually a blessing for borrowers, especially the governments. The reason is simple. When you borrow money today, you are borrowing it in today's dollars. But when you pay it back in the future, inflation means that those dollars are worth less when you originally borrowed them. Essentially, you are repaying debt with cheaper dollars. Let's look at a real-world scenario and see how this plays out. Back in the 1960s, the median home price in the US was well under $50,000. If you took out a mortgage, it would have felt like a significant financial commitment. But fast forward to today, and that $50,000 mortgage seems laughable compared to the current median home prices of over $400,000. Inflation has steadily eroded the value of dollars over the past 6 decades, making that 1960s mortgage feels trivial in today's terms. The same principle applies to government debt, of course, on a much bigger scale. While the nominal amount of debt may be rising, the real burden of that debt is shrinking as inflation reduces the value of each dollar owed. In other words, they are inflating away the debt. The way the US finances its debt is through the issuance of Treasury bonds. When the government runs a deficit, meaning it spends more than it collects in taxes, it borrows the difference by selling those bonds to investors. These investors could be individuals, corporations, or even foreign governments. Countries like China and Japan are some of the largest holders of US debt, and they continue to buy Treasury bonds because they see them as a safe investment. But here's the trick: when these bonds come due, the government does not necessarily pay them off using the tax revenue. Instead, it often rolls the debt over by issuing new bonds to pay off the old ones. It's a common practice in government finance, and it allows the US to maintain a high level of debt without ever fully paying it off. It's laughable when you think about it, kind of like using one credit card to pay off another. But as long as there's demand for the US Treasury bonds, the government can continue this process indefinitely. And that part is important. The demand has to continue for this to be sustainable. Then one of the most important metric to consider when evaluating a country's debt is its debt to GDP ratio. This by far is a better indicator of economic health than simply looking at the total amount of debt, because it takes into account the size and productivity of the economy. A country like the US, with a massive economy and significant global influence, can carry on a much larger debt load than smaller nations because its economic output, or the GDP, can support it. The US currently has a debt to GDP ratio of around 129%, which means that its total debt exceeds the annual economic output by 29%. That sounds like a lot, but as you can see that the US is far from the highest on this list. Japan, for example, has a debt to GDP ratio of 264%, yet it hasn't collapsed under the weight of its debt. This is why the US needs to focus not just on the absolute dollar amount it owes, but also to keep its debt to GDP ratio in check. A rising debt load isn't necessarily a problem if the economy is growing at a healthy rate. The key is to ensure that the GDP, or the total value of goods and services produced by the government, grows fast enough to keep up with or outpace the accumulation of debt. If GDP grows, the economy can handle a larger debt load, just as an individual with a higher income can afford to carry on more debt than someone with a lower income. But if the US were to see a significant slowdown in economic growth while continuing to borrow more and more, the debt to GDP ratio would significantly rise and the burden of debt would be more acute. Now, this isn't as simple as it sounds. Granted that the US has been able to manage their debt so far through inflation and economic growth, not every country is able to do so. And one of the most striking examples of this in the recent past is Greece during the 2008 financial crisis. In the years leading up to the crisis, Greece borrowed heavily to finance public spending and social programs, allowing its debt to GDP ratio to balloon. Their debt to GDP was slowly increasing, but unlike the US, Greece did not have a strong enough economy to sustain this level of debt. Secondly, because Greece is part of the Eurozone, it does not control its own currency. And this is a critical difference from the US and other countries like Japan that manage their own monetary policy and can borrow in their own currency. Without the ability to devalue its currency to make its debt more manageable or control inflation directly, Greece had no way to inflate away its debt. Instead, it was forced to rely on external bailouts from European Union and International Monetary Fund, or IMF. Another country that experienced a similar fate is Argentina. Like Greece, Argentina was unable to sustain its debt because its economy wasn't growing as fast to keep up with all the borrowing. These examples show the dangers of failing to manage debt properly. Now, you might be wondering how inflation, which seems too good of a thing in this context, can be managed without spiraling out of control. This is where the Federal Reserve comes in. The Federal Reserve, or the Fed as it's commonly known, is responsible for managing the money supply and controlling inflation. One of its primary tools is adjusting interest rates. When inflation gets too high, the Fed raises interest rates to cool the economy down. When inflation is too low, it lowers rates to encourage borrowing and spending. This balancing act is crucial to ensure that inflation stays at manageable levels, enough to erode the debt, but not enough to cause a major chaos. The Fed's target inflation rate is around 2% per year. This may not sound like much, but over the years, it adds up. At 2% inflation, the value of dollar is roughly halved every 35 years. This means that while the US government continues to accumulate debt, the real burden of the debt is shrinking every day. You have to understand that the game here is not to pay off the debt. The game is about managing it. The US government has no intention of paying down its debt to zero. And to be very frank, they don't have to. And this is the crux of the strategy. The US borrows money today to invest in the economy and lets inflation and growth reduce the real value of debt over time. By allowing inflation to gradually erode the value of its debt, the US can continue to borrow and spend without ever needing to completely pay off its obligations. This strategy has worked in the past and it is working right now. As long as inflation remains in control and the economy continues to grow, the US debt will likely remain manageable. Which brings me to my final topic of discussion. If you are a saver, you're losing your buying power every day. In an inflationary economy like the US, savings alone is not enough to keep up. Investing is essential to preserve and grow your wealth. When prices rise, the buying power of each dollar steadily declines, making cash savings worthless over time. This environment punishes savers who don't put their money to work, as inflation erodes the value of stagnant cash. The stock market, for instance, has historically provided returns above inflation, making it one of the most reliable tools for long-term growth. The notion that the US must pay off its debt in full is rooted in outdated thinking. By leveraging inflation and keeping the debt to GDP ratio in check, the US can continue to borrow and can gradually reduce the weight of its debt. Do I favor this approach? Not at all. Do I favor the government intentionally reducing the buying power of every dollar? Not at all. But the average Joe does not realize that this isn't accidental. It's an intentional strategy, and that this isn't a flaw in the system. It's how the system is designed to work.